Nilou is finally getting her second rerun in Genshin Impact, and after running the meta for most of Sumeru, some people have said that she has fallen off. And while I do think that a whole new wave of very powerful DPSs came with Fontaine, Nilou is still an extremely powerful character, still shines as a top meta pick in certain scenarios, and is a very solid one in others. I've been testing her with every single Hydro and Dendro character to give you as much information to help you decide if you should get her and to help you make the most out of her if you do. We're also going to talk about the current state of Bloom, whether that be Nilou Bloom, Hyperbloom, and Burgeon, whether it's still the most broken free-to-play team in the game, or if Fontaine was so strong that it's been power crept out. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. Nilou is one of a kind, completely redefining the Bloom reaction, making them deal much more damage and exploding instantly, and exploding in a much wider AoE than normal. When you play with Nilou, you completely redefine what you know about gameplay, team building, and damage. She has the most restrictive passive in the game, limiting you to just Hydro and Dendro characters. And the thing that suddenly matters most of all is elemental application. You'll start by using Nilou's triple skill or double skill into normal attack, depending on how you play her, and applying a lot of Hydro and Dendro to create as many blooms as possible. The bloom damage is based on Nilou's HP, so your biggest goal is to give her a fat stack of HP, and from there it's based on the elemental mastery of whoever triggered the bloom. The ideal scenario is you apply a lot of Dendro, and that Dendro is the dominant elemental aura on the enemy. The reason you want this is because when Hydro is applied to Dendro, you can create more total blooms than if Dendro is applied to Hydro. And because you still want a lot of Hydro to have a lot of blooms, Dendro application becomes one of the names of the game. And that is where enter Nahida. In my opinion, Nahida is pretty much a necessity for Nilou teams. I don't like playing them without Nahida, and probably neither will you. Certain abysses can be totally good with Nilou without Nahida, but in my opinion, you just don't want to do that to yourself. If you don't have Nahida, it's fine. You can get her on the rerun, but if you don't ever plan on getting Nahida, at least until we get another Dendro character that applies as much Dendro or a similar amount to Nahida, I wouldn't bother with Nilou for now. The damage of the cores is generally based on the elemental mastery of the character triggering the cores, which will hopefully be your Hydro character. Even if your Hydro character isn't built on full elemental mastery, the blooms will still deal a sizable chunk of damage because Nilou's passive just buffs the blooms so much innately. In addition, Nahida's burst also buffs the elemental mastery of the on-field character, so if you're using an on-fielder like Ayato, even if he is not built on full EM, his blooms are still going to be doing a sizable chunk of damage. This means that you don't have to build full EM on your Hydro characters. You can use damage dealers such as Ayato or Furina. We'll go over all the team comps in the next section. It is generally speaking good to have some EM on your Dendros as well, because it will inevitably proc some of the blooms as well, but you definitely don't need to focus on giving them a ton of EM. It'll be just fine. In addition, if you do happen to have Nilou's signature weapon, which boosts the elemental mastery of the team, as well as boosting her. Oh yeah, and finally, Sigewinne. I actually spent a bunch more time testing Sigewinne with Nilou stuff, and it was actually better than I remember the first time I tested it. I still don't recommend it, but it is doable. You'll want to do Sigewinne, Furina, and Baiju. You'll want to do Sigewinne, Furina, and Nahida. Sigewinne obviously being your healer, and a little bit of extra Hydro application here and there on top of Furina. I think the biggest thing you want to do when you play that team is to time your Sigewinne burst to be during the downtime of Sigewinne's skill, because Sigewinne's skill does have downtime from the Hydro application, and then time your Nilou's burst to be during the downtime. That way you always have solid Hydro application, and then you want to on-field Nahida during most of the time, so that you have enough Dendro on the enemy, so that when you use like Sigewinne's burst, for example, or Nilou's burst, or Sigewinne's skill, that you're mostly on-field Nahida, so that you still have lots of Dendro on the enemy to get the most out of those periods of high Hydro. I think the team is pretty good, and I think I think it does work. It's not like inherently synergistic, but if you happen to have them both and you don't have Kokomi, but you do have Furina, Sigewinne, and Nahida, then I think that that's something that you can make work, and I think it's pretty good. I think it's better than the better than like the but well, I think it's on the same level as most of the other beast stuff. Makes them pretty relevant threats on her team. This also makes her quite a free-to-play friendly pick, and as long as you have Nahida, you would be hard-pressed to find an account that doesn't have solid options for the last 2 slots. But in my opinion, there are definitely 5 stars that take the cake and make her a lot more comfy to play. So she's quite free-to-play friendly, one of the best characters in AoE situations, pretty solid in single target, but in my opinion, she does have one major weakness. When there are very strong cryo shields, and I'm not talking about little shields like the Abyss Mages, but when there's a cryo lector, or if they ever, God forbid, introduce a dendro lector into the Abyss, Nilou can absolutely struggle to break that shield. And it is not very often, but sometimes there have been dendro or dendro immune enemies on one side, or highly dendro resistant enemies on one side, or a very single target orient on one side, and then cryo shields on the other side. And I do understand you can bring a Claymore character like Kave to break the shields, but that still requires a pretty high investment level, because it is pretty slow if they're strong shields. If it's Abyss Mages and they're fairly weak shields, it's not such a big deal, and Kave can definitely easily deal with that. But for some really strong shields, when shield breaking is the main difficulty of the Abyss, that is a weakness. We haven't seen this very much in recent Abysses, but it's just something to be aware of. But I still think that her final pro makes her a very good recommendation for new players anyways, because you've got that con, but arguably completely making up for it is the fact that she's the easiest character to build in the entire game. 2 other things I want to mention is the tankiness of Nilou, with free-to-plays easily reaching 68,000 HP, she can basically face tank any hit, and the ideal HP being around 74,000 if you can get her key to max out her passive. The other thing I wanted to mention is the reason why you either need to on-field Nahida or use a second dendro, and it's because of the way Nahida's dendro application works. Her skill will always reapply a lot of dendro only after an elemental reaction, only after a dendro reaction has happened to an enemy. This means that you'll need another source of dendro other than just Nahida's skill, or you'll need lots of enemies close by, because as the dendro aura by the skill gets used up, it'll very quickly stop working. If you didn't understand that, no problem. All you need to know is Nahida's skill is very good at dendro, but it can't keep it up by itself. It needs either her own normal attacks or another dendro to happen once in a while to keep it refreshed. HP, HP, HP. Are you kidding me? And you're going to want to look for Elemental Mastery, which I have not done, so I just definitely need to min-max that. But you look for HP substats, you look for Elemental Mastery substats, you look for flat HP, maybe some ER here and there to get her burst for teams that need it. You don't need to level up her talents. You need to make sure that she's level 90. 2-piece Tenacity, 2-piece Varukasha's Glow. You can get away with a 2-piece EM, but it is insanely good for her and for free-to-play players to have such a low investment option, that even though, like I said, that she wouldn't be a great recommendation as a first or second DPS, she also in a way kind of is, as you're going to be able to slash through content much faster than you would have if you had a crit DPS. So in some sense, she's an amazing first DPS. For Nilou's weapons, the key is the best, her signature. It is a massive upgrade. It is the biggest upgrade for any character's signature weapon. The second best is the Dockhand's Assistant, if you happen to have it. It's pretty good because it gives you HP and some elemental mastery, so pretty nice. But the key really is on a different level, especially because of the buffing to your entire team. If you don't have either of these, totally fine. Iron Sting has some pretty nice drip on her, honestly, and it's really good. Fav can be good for reducing your other team members' energy requirements if you need it. Tokabu is a good option if you want your Nilou to hold an umbrella. It's basically the same as the Iron Sting. And Sacrificial can be an interesting option for both getting her skill and then also using her on-field. So if you want to use on-field Nilou, this can be a good option, especially if you have like really high application dendro characters for your team and you want Nilou to be the one proccing blooms. The thing about her proccing blooms is that, especially if you're using Sacrificial, you're not having all that much elemental mastery like you do with Iron Sting. So yeah, it's more of a fun thing than it's a good thing. If you are fighting specific Fontaine enemies with an Arca alignment, you can actually use the Sword of Nebuchadnezzar, because Nilou doesn't care, especially if you don't have the key, and that can help you break those Ujar Numa shields. The other characters on our team are pretty easy to build, and they're built usually pretty differently than most characters, so I did want to give a little bit of a build guide. Your Nahida should be built on at least 2 out of 3 EM so that she can boost the EM as much as possible, unless you have another character that's built full EM, and then she can be built EM Dendro crit or EM or 2 out of 3 EM. And when I say 2 out of 3, I mean your sands should always be EM, and either your goblet should be or your circlet should be EM, whichever one you happen to have better substats for. You'll usually have a second Dendro character, and you'll generally want to build them either for whatever their intended role is. So if you're running someone like Baiju, you want to run him for healing. If you're running someone like Kale, you want to run her for damage. Kirara, you build her for shielding, etc. And then your Hydro character will usually be built on full EM, but if they are a damaging character like Farina, Ayato, Xingqiu, Yulan, then you can build them on damage, and hopefully you have a few EM substats here and there to give you at least some EM as a baseline, but you'll often be getting Dendro Resonance, and you'll be getting Nahida's buff if you're using them on field, so they still will have some decent EM. Characters like Kokomi, you can run her on full EM, and that will be how you get the most damage, and you'll run her on 4-piece Flowers of Paradise Lost, or 4-piece Gilded Dreams, or 2-piece EM. But you can also switch one of these EM pieces, 1 or 2 of them, for HP pieces, or you can give her Prototype Amber if you're feeling like your damage is good, but you need some more healing. For teams, oh boy. Did I go on a testing spree? I planned to have this video come out last week, but every time I tried to make it, I thought of another character that I should be testing with Nilou, and because on this channel we build and test every single character, I have done so. And I tested her a lot before, but since I'm making the updated guide, I really wanted to make sure that I tested absolutely everyone. So I wanted to start by giving you some like blanket team archetypes that I really like, and then from there we can talk about every single character that I also tested. So the first one I want to talk about is my personal favorite team, and I know I'm like somewhat in the minority, but I really like Ayato, Baiju, Nahida, Nilou. And I understand it's a very expensive team, and Ayato is a pretty low value character for a lot of people because just like Novelette is better, but I really like this team. I like Ayato's off-field Hydro application. I like his very wide AoE. I like the comfiness of Baiju. I like the fact that I can run Ayato either on an EM build or a damage build. The damage build really helps if you have some single target, or if you kind of run out of enemies and you've got one enemy left. The fact that he's on damage can be really nice. I love his cooldowns on this team. It gives you time to switch out and reapply, you know, Nahida, reapply Baiju, reapply Nilou's skill. On all Nilou teams, you want to make sure that her skill is always active. I think it's like Nilou teams kind of feel like an art. Like a lot of other teams, they have very like strict rotations to maximize damage. And Nilou teams, I don't know, it kind of reminds me, like she's a dancer, right? So it kind of reminds me of a dance that you're doing with the enemy. And I know this is kind of going to sound a little bit kind of hokey and weird, but it's almost like a dance. It's almost like an art to master the elemental application of Nilou, to make sure that you always have Dendro, to make sure that you're applying the right things in the right way, that you use the right characters against the right enemies in the right time, especially when it's like a multi-wave scenario, because you can really go from like a solid clear to like an amazing clear depending on how you're mastering your elemental application. The key thing in this team is to truly make sure that you always have enough ER for Nahida to burst, that you have enough ER for Baiju to burst, that you refresh Baiju's skill a decent amount, because you want to have as much Dendro application as you can to make sure that you're maximizing the blooms that Ayato's getting. And his burst is just so nice to give you such a wide AoE, and his skill is such a wide AoE. But I do pretty much equally love the Kokomi team. I know I am historically a Kokomi downer, but after doing a lot of testing and testing with all the Hydro characters, I think this team is better than this team. Now, I know I said that this was my favorite. I do think that the Kokomi team is a little bit better, especially when conditions are met, because Kokomi you just have a bit more elemental applications. You can get more blooms with this team. I don't have the key for Nilou, but I do run Kale on Elegy for the End. If you happen to have Elegy for the End, you can use that, but if not, it's okay. Sacrificial bow is still good. She actually uses the high base attack. You build her on Emblem on this team for damage, and especially if you have high constellation Kale, she's actually really good on this team. You can use Kirara in this slot as well if you prefer. And then I like to use Kokomi on full EM these days, but if there is, you know, really aggressive enemies or like corrosion or something, maybe you switch to a bit of HP. This team also feels like a dance to keep your elemental application, because you want to keep up your biggest damaging points will be when Kale uses her burst, and you really want to go to town with Kokomi to get as much hydro application during that time. You can use Kokomi's burst, or you can just have her skill active while you refresh everything. So she has permanent uptime. Sacrificial is so perfect on Kokomi, sacrificial fragments, because it allows you to have that extra skill use while also boosting her EM. So it's just perfect on this team. And yeah, I really like these. These are my 2 favorite Nilou teams. If you can scrounge together either ones of these, and again, I'd say Kale is fairly flexible. You can run Dendro main character if you want more consistency for another free-to-play option, and you can run Kirara for a more comfy option. But both of these are really good. I would say both of them are also strong enough to brute force single target content. Even though this one doesn't have a traditional damage dealer, it still is strong enough to brute force single target content. And then this one is also strong enough to brute force single target content, and it's also strong enough to like kill a few Dendro slimes or Dendro specters here and there with if you build Ayato for damage, whereas this one doesn't really have that option. Another option I quite like is the Furina variant, where you've got Furina Baiju. You're going to on-field Nahida to get the max Dendro. You can occasionally on-field Nilou if you want. I haven't experimented with on-field Nilou too much, but I know a lot of Nilou mains really like it. Generally, I don't think it's ever optimal to on-field Nilou. So yeah, I like this team. I like this team. This team's pretty good. I don't like it as much as the other two, but it is a good option, especially if you do have a higher constellation Furina, then you'll probably see pretty nice gains, especially if you have C2. You'll want to like I said, you'll want to on-field Nahida. By the way, the Ayato one, you can swap out Baiju for Yao Yao. It's not quite as good because you might have to waste some time on Yao Yao to heal your team that might take away from Ayato's skill usage, but it does have some downtime, and Ayato does have off-field application, so Yao does work if you want to build this team but don't want to get Baiju. Oh, and also for this team, Baiju can definitely be replaced for Yao Yao, because on this team you definitely have the on-field space to be able to afford Yao Yao some field time. The other team I really like is the Candace Yao Yao version, and especially now upgrading to C6 Candace, I like this team even more. I don't like this team as much when the enemies are lower. This is a team that works much better when conditions are good for Nilou, but when conditions are good for Nilou, the team pops off. You do need at least C1 Candace to make this team work, because it extends the duration of the Hydro Infusion, which is just too short. Basically, the goal of this team is to use Candace to Hydro Infuse your Yao Yao, who's built on full EM, and Yao Yao will normal attack. It's really awesome, and it's a really awesome use case for Candace, and she's actually really good on this team. If you do have the key, it might actually be strong enough to brute force single target. I'm definitely going to try it once I get the key. There's also, of course, the free-to-play friendly Barbara variant, and you have a couple options here. You can do Barbara Kale for just a straight one-to-one replacement for Kokomi, or you can do Box Cat, and where you actually run around in box form as Kirara, hugging the enemies really close. Both versions of this team are actually good, and Barbara is definitely, again, better the tighter the enemies are grouped up, because her AoE versus Kokomi is not nearly as wide. So I definitely prefer Kokomi. And if you really love Nilou, you want to get, I would say, either Kokomi or Ayato. But Barbara can absolutely work until you get those characters, or just in general, if you just really like Barbara and you want to use Barbara, it's totally doable. You also have the option of on-fielding Nahida and doing something like this and having Yelan or Xingqiu on the team and doing a triple Hydro comp instead of a double Hydro. Most people do like to go for double Dendro and don't go for the triple Hydro, but I have found that this team can perform quite well as well. It's especially nice just to have a raw damaging character, so that if you do get stuck with a single enemy or spread out enemies or a single target boss fight, then Yelan or Xingqiu can be good. It's not as good as the other stuff, but it still does work. Instead of going through every other single team option, I have put together a tier list of who I think her best partners are. I'm kind of torn as to whether I want to have Ayato Baiju in S tier or Ayato Baiju, but it's kind of like I kind of do want to put them up there, but then it's like, should I also put Yao Yao up there? I'm not really sure. I kind of, in my heart, I kind of feel like this, but like on paper, I know it's probably like this, but I'm just gonna be a little bit generous and follow my heart and say that this is sort of like the team pairing. What it really is like, it really is like this. Like Nahida's just on a different level. Like she's basically part of the character. Yeah, I feel okay about this. I will say anyone in B is still perfectly fine. Like this isn't B as in like trash. This is just like still some good stuff. I've already talked about everyone in S, but going through an A, we've already talked about Candace. We've talked about Yelan, we've talked about Xingqiu. Neuvillette and Alhaitham are solid options, especially if you have well-built Neuvillette or Alhaitham. You just want to use them together with Nilou. Both of them have better teams, and Nilou also has better teams, but especially because Novelette is so broken, if you're, if you have the characters free and say you're using your Kazuha, your Zhongli on the other side, and you want to put your Novelette with your Nilou, or you just like them together, then it's totally good, totally doable. I mean, you could probably, because Novelette's so broken, you could probably put it in A. I just kind of have him in B because it's like he's B for better off using other teams. Dendro main character, really, really close to being an A. You could definitely argue that. Same with Barbara, really close. I would say these rankings, because what Nilou really cares about is the elemental application, and then some damage can be nice. And then Kaveh can be a good driver. I did test with Kaveh. I don't have C6, so I don't know, maybe we try and get C6 Kaveh so I can test it more when he does have C6, but I think I have him at C2 as of that point. It's like solid, like you can do it, but I don't really like it like a crazy amount. You kind of on-field him, and then I was using Xingqiu in the second slot, and then having Nahida, and your Xingqiu and Nahida are liable to die, and your Kaveh is there. And finally, Sigewinne. I actually spent a bunch more time testing Sigewinne with Nilou stuff, and it was actually better than I remember the first time I tested it. I still don't like recommend it, but it is doable. You'll want to do Sigewinne, Farina, and Nahida. Sigewinne obviously being your healer, and a little bit of extra hydro application here and there on top of Farina. I think the biggest thing you want to do when you play that team is to time your Sigewinne burst to be during the downtime of Sigewinne's skill, because Sigewinne's skill does have downtime from the hydro application, and then time your Nilou's burst to be during the downtime. That way you always have solid hydro application, and then you want to on-field Nahida during most of the time, so that you have enough dendro on the enemy, so that when you use like Sigewinne's burst, for example, or Nilou's burst, or Sigewinne's skill, that you're mostly on-field Nahida, so that you still have lots of dendro on the enemy to get the most out of those periods of high hydro. I think the team is pretty good, and I think I think it does work. It's not like inherently synergistic, but if you happen to have them both and you don't have Kokomi, but you do have Farina, Sigewinne, and Nahida, then I think that's something that you can make work, and I think it's pretty good. I think it's better than like the well, I think it's on the same level as most of the other B stuff. I really like that Nilou just takes Nahida as a meta unit, but other than that, like, she takes a bunch of non-meta units and makes them viable and or even great or good. And until we got Novelette, she was like the premier AoE character. Now she still is a premier AoE character, but Novelette's just a bit better. So, and Novelette, even though he's not as easy to build as Nilou, he's still very easy to build because of the Marishisei Hunter set giving so much crit. So he still ends up being a very easy character to build. I would put her in tier 1 for both power and for value. She can utilize basically the scraps of your account to make a good team. She's very easy to build, and she has a lot of power, and she has some vertical investment, especially if you want to go for a signature weapon. It's better to go for that than go for her constellations. Her C2 is a pretty solid increase for her bloom teams, but her other constellations are mostly focused on vape, which is needed because her vape is really lacking and not very good at C0. But I generally would recommend Nahida C2, as it is a slightly better increase than Nilou's C2, and also is more universal. So you want to get probably the key first, then Nahida's C2, and then if you want to go further from there, you can look at Nilou C2, but she's plenty strong with just C0 Nahida and the key, or plenty strong with just how she is. Mine are all C0, and I don't even have her weapon yet. I would say she functions kind of differently than the other Hydro characters. Like, the other Hydro characters are very flexible and can be used in like Vape or Hyperbloom or all these different things, whereas Nilou has to be used in Nilou teams, which does make her less flexible in the sense of the kinds of teams she can work in. But those teams that she does work in are still very strong and are still very flexible. So although she's not like a good all-in-one generalist Hydro character, she's still a great pick for a DPS. I consider her like a DPS in terms of value. She is one of the good DPSs that you can go for. You've got the best DPSs, which is Novelette, maybe Arlecchino, and then sort of I think the rest of the DPSs are the good DPSs in my opinion, and she is definitely one of the good DPSs. She's very easy to play in the sense that she doesn't require strict rotations, but it does require you to sort of pay attention. Like I said, it's sort of a dance to make sure you keep up the proper elemental reactions. For future prospects for Nilou, I think they're really quite high. I mean, any Dendro character or Hydro character in the future could hypothetically work with Nilou. They're not like imminent because she already has her teams are set. Like she doesn't really need an upgrade. Like I would say probably the most obvious one is a 5-star Kale. Just like a 5-star Dendro character that's an off-field or even an on-field DPS. Nah, an off-field DPS that does a lot of Dendro damage. That is what Nilou needs, just a 5-star version of Kale, because Kale is like a decent character but not like a crazy character. So if we could get an off-field Dendro DPS that applied a lot of Dendro and just did a lot of damage, maybe in a shorter burst than Nahida, so it's not like as much of a continuous thing, but it's more like Kale. I think that is the most obvious upgrade that Nilou could get. And then, but other than that, pretty much any Hydro or Dendro character has the potential to work with her. Now that we're through all that, what is the state of Bloom? Hyperbloom, Burgeon, and Nilou Bloom. These are sort of the 3 types of Bloom teams. They definitely ran the meta for Sumeru, especially the low investment free-to-play meta. And I did test Burgeon a bunch, Toma Burgeon in various variations, and I thought it was okay. But I feel like since it hasn't gotten any dedicated support and so many other powerful units have come up through Fontaine, and Farina's come up, and so many other powerful DPSs and team archetypes, Shenhe Plunge, different stuff, I feel like I don't like Burgeon as much as I used to. I still think it's like good and it's like decent and it's like solid for certain elemental checks, but I generally feel like Burgeon has kind of fallen off like something I would recommend. It's like a fun thing to try out, but I feel like we need like some dedicated Burgeon character. It doesn't have to necessarily be a pyro character, but some kind of dedicated Burgeon to bring the team back. And no, Emily probably won't reinvigorate Burgeon. Maybe there's a chance, but probably not. We probably want a specific Burgeon character. And no, I don't think Emily will work well with Nilou because her application is not very good and doesn't act, and you know, Emily needs burning. So yeah, for Burgeon, I'm not much of a fan right now. We need a 5-star Burgeon character. It's still fine, like it still works, but yeah, I think my favorite team that uses Burgeon is Hu Tao, Farina, Yelan, Baiju. I think that's my favorite Burgeon team right now. Quite strong, really strong. If you have those units, give that a try. That slaps. One of my favorite Hu Tao teams, actually. I think it's my strongest yoimiya team too, and I know I'm aware it sounds goofy, but try it. For Hyperbloom, I still think Hyperbloom is really good. I would put Hyperbloom on the same level as the good DPSs, but its advantage is that it's easy to play. So if you think of Hyperbloom as a DPS, right, the real DPS of Hyperbloom, like you still need to have some good other units, right? It still takes valuable units. It still takes Nahida, still takes Yelan, maybe Singcho for the other slot, maybe Farina, maybe Alhaitham, and then usually Kuki. You can use Raiden, but I really like the role consolidation of healing for Kuki. I think Kuki is better here. Of course, you can use Ayato, you can use Nouvelette as well, but generally it's going to be those things. And if you think of that concept as a DPS, like the Hyperbloom core, if you use strong characters with Nahida and Kuki and then strong Hydros, I would put it on the same level. I think Nouvelette is a little bit better because of the AoE and the good single target, but Hyperbloom is just so easy to play and it's so consistent and it has such good damage. Like, yeah, technically a really well invested Hu Tao, really well invested Linny, Arlecchino, you know, well invested Zhao, Wanderer, etc. Yeah, they're going to outperform Hyperbloom, but it's the fact that it's so easy to use and easy to play. And it's actually like, I think really underrated in AoE, how strong it is too, because you create more blooms when you're in AoE. And the Hyperblooms have a very small AoE, which isn't really relevant, but the damage is just high and consistent enough. And it's that it still performs fine in AoE. And it also is really good in multi-wave. It's because its rotations are so flexible. It does both Hydro and Dendro damage, and it has Electro application, so it covers a wide variety of elemental checks. And in general, I'm just a huge fan of it. It was one of my go-to teams for a long time. I don't think it's the only great free-to-play team anymore though, because now we have Nouvelette, now we have Navia. It's just the unparalleled consistency of Hyperbloom. If I were to choose Hyperbloom the way I have it on my account versus Nilou without the key, Hyperbloom to me slightly edges out overall as like a preferable Bloom team. I would prefer, it just feels a bit more consistent and Nilou feels just a bit more Abyss dependent than Hyperbloom does. But I think I'm gonna change my mind when I get Nilou with the key, because I think it'll probably push the damage over the top, but I'll have to wait until I get it to let you know. For Overworld, Nilou feels pretty trash to me. I definitely don't like her very much in the Overworld. I kind of almost would prefer her on, I don't know, a Hyperbloom team for the Overworld, just because there's a bunch of enemies that are like a dendro enemies, or like you're just very restricted in the team comps that you can make for the overworld. It's still fine. Like obviously it does tons of damage, so you're still gonna be fine. But just the restrictive teams is just sort of a pain. Like, you know, I can't use my Kazuha, can't use Shenhe, etc, etc, but it still definitely works. Overall, I like Nilou a lot. She's one of the most unique characters, one of the most fun characters, and if you end up liking her playstyle and you want to get her, I definitely would never discourage you from it, because she's awesome and she's good, and I think she's gonna be good for a long time. She is the very strongest under the right circumstances, and I don't think that'll ever go away, because it's actually insane what she can do under the right circumstance. So let me know your thoughts. Take care. Bye for now.